It was 1942, and British railwaymen laughed when the first boxy, soot-black spam cans clattered off American freighters. Temporary rubbish, they called them, an insult to everything Europe's great railroads once stood for. But as death tolls rose and boiler explosions shook their skepticism, those ugly, mass-produced locomotives became Europe's lifeline. By the thousands, they would outlast their critics, fueling an unlikely rescue that rewrote the story of post-war survival. Why did the world's most ridiculed engine end up rebuilding half a continent? The answer begins with disaster and a pride too fragile for what came next. Steam once meant spectacle. In pre-war Europe, locomotives were national signatures, sleek, streamlined, and polished to a mirror shine. LNERA4. Pacifics in Britain flashed by in blue and silver, setting speed records. In France, the Chapelon Pacifics drew crowds just for their elegance. Workshops at Swindon and La Chapelle turned out engines that were as much about pride as performance, each detail a mark of craftsmanship. Then, in November 1942, the first American S160 locomotives arrived at Doncaster. Instead of sweeping curves and gleaming brass, these engines looked like something from a packing crate, boxy and slab-sided, with a combined dome and sandbox perched awkwardly on the boiler. The cab was a plain steel box, the tender oversized and ungainly by British standards. There was no sign of streamlining, no attempt at grace, just rivets and right angles. To men used to thoroughbreds, this was a mongrel in work boots. British drivers, gathered on the platform, watched as the new arrivals were unloaded from their freighters. The joke started before the engines even cooled. One fireman muttered that the S160 locomotives looked like they had been built from leftover shipping containers. Another called it a dustbin on wheels. On the LNER, crews complained about the high running boards and the sheer bulk of the American tender. The word temporary floated through the sheds with a sneer. These were not engines to be loved, just endured until something proper could be built again. The differences went deeper than looks. The controls felt foreign, the layout awkward. British crews found the fittings on the S160 locomotives unfamiliar, the ride rough, and the brakes lacking. Stories spread of men refusing turns on the new engines, or drawing lots in the mess room to see who would have to take one out. Even the sound was wrong, a harsh, rattling clatter, nothing like the measured beat of a Gressley or Stanier. In Poland and Hungary, the skepticism was the same. Crews saw the American imports as modern, yes, but crude and noisy. They missed the solid feel of home-built engines, the sense of tradition in every lever and gauge. Yet, for all the mockery, the S160 locomotives kept coming. Over 2,000 would be built by the war's end. Hundreds shipped to Britain and then scattered across Europe. The first impression stuck. These were not engines for the ages, just tools to be used up and forgotten. In the eyes of the men who worked them, beauty had been replaced by brute necessity. The insult was not just in the shape, but in the very idea, a machine that asked for no admiration, only obedience. Steam under pressure is a force that brooks no error. In the first months after the S160 locomotives arrived, British fitters and firemen found themselves facing more than just awkward controls and unfamiliar fittings. The real threat came from inside the boiler. Unlike their home engines, the American imports carried only a single water gauge, an unfamiliar design that could give a dangerously false reading if its valves were not fully opened. One moment, the glass showed a safe level, the next, the crown sheet, the thin roof of the firebox could be left exposed, glowing red-hot above a dwindling pool of water. If the water dropped too low, the metal would weaken and collapse under the full weight of the boiler steam. In 1943, the first explosion tore through a newly arrived S160 locomotive. Two more followed in quick succession, all traced to the same fault: weak crown stays and a misleading water gauge. A boiler explosion is a violent event. Iron plates buckle, rivets shear away, scalding steam blasts through the cab. The force can lift a locomotive from its wheels and leave nothing but twisted wreckage. For crews, the prospect of climbing aboard an S160 became a test of nerve. Jokes about ugly engines gave way to whispered warnings in the mess room. Some men flatly refused to take a turn on the American engines, citing the accidents as proof that these were not just crude, but unsafe. The Ministry of Transport opened a formal inquiry. Inspectors combed through the wreckage, measuring the failed stays and testing the water gauges. The findings were blunt. The American design, rushed for wartime needs, had not accounted for the habits and expectations of British railwaymen. The single gauge was unfamiliar and easily misread. The crown stays, too thin for the stresses of British firing practice, could not be trusted. Orders went out. All S160 locomotives in service would be retrofitted, with stronger stays and additional water gauges before further use. In the sheds, the mood grew tense. Fitters worked late into the night, stripping fireboxes and fitting new stays under the harsh glare of arc lamps. French and British crews shared stories of close calls, each incident a reminder that the line between workhorse and widowmaker was perilously thin. The S160 had arrived as an object of mockery, but now it was a source of real fear, a machine that demanded respect. For every man who swung up into the cab, the question was no longer about pride or beauty, it was survival. Production orders for the S160 went out in the spring of 1942. With the war at its height, the U.S. Army Transportation Corps needed a locomotive that could be built in record time and shipped in bulk wherever Allied railways were desperate for power. The task landed on the desks of three giants, the American Locomotive Company, Baldwin, and Lima. These were the same firms that had churned out thousands of engines for North America, but now they were asked to do something different. To build a single standardized design with every bolt and bracket matching the same drawings, no matter which factory it came from. Inside the drafting rooms, engineers from the War Department and the builders met around conference tables, arguing over which fittings to keep and which to simplify. The goal was not elegance or even comfort. It was speed. Speed of assembly, speed of delivery, and speed on the rails. Major J.W. Marsh, a leading figure in the USATC railway branch, signed off on a plan that would see the S160 built in 13 batches, each one identical to the last. Drawings were copied, specifications fixed, and the assembly lines retooled. Every engine would use the same 280 wheel arrangement, the same 225 pounds per square inch boiler, the same outside cylinders. If a part fit one S160, it fit them all. The numbers tell their own story. Between 1942 and 1945, the three builders produced 2,120 S160 locomotives for the U.S. Army Transportation Corps. That is nearly 2 engines a day, every day, for 3 years. The American Locomotive Company, Baldwin, and Lima worked around the clock, casting frames, riveting boilers, assembling tenders, each plant feeding the same relentless machine. Some days, engines rolled straight from the erecting shop to the loading dock, still warm from their first firing, ready to be hoisted onto ships bound for Liverpool, Le Havre, Naples, or Vladivostok. The scale of the operation dwarfed anything most European railways had ever attempted. Before the war, a flagship express engine might take months to build, each one a little different from the last, each one a matter of national pride. Now, hundreds of S160 locomotives were boxed up and stacked on the docks, their serial numbers stamped in neat order, their dimensions checked with American precision. The first 800 went to Britain, enough to fill entire depots. Hundreds more followed, bound for France, Italy, Poland, Greece, and beyond. Some arrived in kit form, to be assembled on arrival in India or North Africa. Others were routed through Britain, then ferried across the Channel in the wake of the D-Day landings. Shipping records from the period read like inventory lists from a warehouse, not the romantic ledgers of a golden age. Each batch had its own manifest, engine numbers, tonnage, and destination ports. Losses at sea were rare but noted. The vast majority arrived intact. The S160 was designed to fit standard European gauge, but variants were built for Russian and Indian tracks too, each one a slight tweak on the master plan. Spare parts traveled alongside the engines, crates of rods, wheels, and valves, so that any damaged unit could be patched up from the same pool of supplies. Standardization was the watchword. If a wheel set failed in Naples, a replacement could be pulled from a crate shipped from Pennsylvania. If a boiler tube burst in Warsaw, the part numbers matched those in Athens or Budapest. The logistics officers who managed these flows thought in terms of fleets, not individuals. The S-160 was a tool for moving coal, grain, and troops, not a symbol of national pride. For the first time, Europe's railways were being supplied not with custom-built marvels, but with industrial output on an American scale. The numbers, 2,120 locomotives, 3 builders, dozens of countries, made the point clear. This was not about beauty. It was about having enough engines to keep the rails moving, no matter what had been lost. On the shop floor, the S-160 was a machine built for survival, not admiration. Wartime Europe needed locomotives that could keep moving, no matter what the rails or the fuel supply looked like. American engineers understood this. Every detail of the S-60 pointed to one thing: function above all else. The axle load, set at just under 16 tons, meant these engines could run on lines that heavier pre-war giants would have torn up or derailed on. Bombed bridges, hastily patched tracks, and makeshift sidings did not stop the SI from rolling. Workshop managers in Britain, France, and Poland have found that the same axles, rods, and bearings fit every engine in the fleet. If a part wore out in Naples, a replacement could be scavenged from a crate in Warsaw or borrowed from a dead engine in Budapest. Crews did not need master machinists or months of downtime to keep these engines running. A hammer, a wrench, and a bit of ingenuity would do. Fuel was another battlefield. The S-160's flexibility mattered. Coal shortages were routine. In Greece, Italy, and the Balkans, coal trains themselves had to be hauled in from far away, and what arrived was often low-grade or mixed with dirt. Each engine could be built or quickly converted to burn either coal or oil. In some places, local workshops even experimented with burning whatever was at hand: lignite, wood scraps, sometimes agricultural waste. The firebox was broad and forgiving, able to swallow poor fuel and still make steam. This flexibility kept trains moving when more refined engines sat cold for lack of the right coal or a missing oil injector. The tender, oversized by European standards, carried enough water and coal for long hauls between ruined depots. A driver in Hungary could run a freight train for hours without needing to refill, bypassing bombed-out water towers or empty coaling plants. The S-60 specs were not remarkable on paper. 225 seaside boiler pressure, 19 by 26-inch outside cylinders, and a tractive effort of around 31,500 pounds meant the engine could pull heavy loads at a steady 40 miles per hour, day after day, on tracks that would have shaken apart a more delicate design. The reliability of that performance was what mattered on the line. Maintenance was stripped to the essentials. Parts were standardized and simple. The S-160 ran on grease-lubricated axle boxes, with bearings simple enough to be serviced by hand in a field shed. When the lubricators failed, hot boxes were a hazard, but the fix was straightforward and familiar to any fitter. The Walschaerts valve gear, mounted outside the frame, could be adjusted or repaired without stripping half the engine. For workshop crews used to the intricate linkages of pre-war compounds, this was a relief. If an engine broke down in Yugoslavia or Poland, the odds were good that a spare could be found, swapped, and the train back on the rails before the end of the shift. European locomotives before the war were built for pride and performance. They demanded skilled hands, special tools, and a steady supply of custom parts, luxuries that vanished with the factories and the men lost to bombing and battle. The S-160, ugly and unlovable, was built for a world where nothing could be counted on. It ran on bad track, burned bad fuel, and kept moving when everything else stopped. In the chaos of reconstruction, that was the difference between a nation fed and a nation waiting in the cold. The men who kept these engines running learned to respect what they once mocked. The S-160 was not beautiful, but it was exactly what the moment demanded. In Poland, the S-160s rolled on long after their supposed expiration date. By the 1960s, PKP had reclassified them as Tier 201 and TR 203, lowered their boiler pressure to 13 bar, and capped their speed at 65 kilometers per hour. These engines, built for a few years of war, settled into decades of steady freight work. In Yugoslavia and Hungary, the story was the same. Mechanics stripped parts from dead engines to keep the rest running. Some workshops even built new boilers locally, giving old frames a second life. A depot mechanic in Katowice remembers the routine. You'd get a TR-203 in for overhaul, and half the time, the parts came from another engine that had already done its share. We called them the patchwork fleet, but they always went back out. In Greece, S-160s burned poor coal, lignite, or whatever fuel could be found. In Turkey, they became the backbone of secondary lines. Withdrawal dates stretched ever further. Most British and French engines disappeared in the 1950s, as national industries recovered and new locomotives arrived. But in Poland, S-160s worked regular trains into the 1980s. In Hungary and Turkey, they lasted even longer. The final chapter came in Bosnia, where the last S-60s were still in service as late as 1995. For a machine designed to be disposable, 50 years at work was never part of the plan. Yet, across Europe, the so-called temporary engines outlived many of the masterpieces they once replaced. By the late 1970s, the story of the S-60 had taken an unexpected turn. Engines once dismissed as disposable tools were now drawing crowds on quiet branch lines, not for their workhorse drudgery, but for their place in history. In Britain, a new generation of railway volunteers set out to save what officialdom had overlooked. Their target was not a thoroughbred or a streamliner, but the American-built S-160s, engines that had once been the butt of every joke in the mess room. Number 6046, built by Baldwin in 1945, became a symbol of this reversal. After working in Poland as TR-203274, it was brought back to the UK and painstakingly restored. Today, it steams out of the Chinnor and Prince's Risborough Railway. Its boxy lines and broad tender now, the subject of admiration and even affection. The same engine that once rattled through the Black Country on borrowed time is now a prized exhibit, its American whistle echoing across the Chiltern Hills. The movement grew beyond a single locomotive. Across the UK heritage lines like the Keighley and Worth Valley and the North Yorkshire Moors Railway welcomed S-160s into their collections. Some, like number 6046, had spent decades abroad before coming home. Others were rescued from scrapyards, their frames patched and boilers retubed by volunteers who saw value in their story. In museum halls and on preserved railways, the S-60 is now celebrated as a survivor, a machine that outlived its critics and became a living link to the age of Reconstruction. What began as an engine to be endured is now an engine to be cherished. Standardization once mocked, as soulless efficiency, now shapes everything from global supply chains to emergency engineering. The S-160's ugly utility became Europe's lifeline, its design philosophy now embedded in how we rebuild after crisis, fast, adaptable, and just good enough to endure. Resilience rarely looks the way we expect. What we dismiss today might be the blueprint for survival tomorrow. Share your thoughts below.